Good afternoon, everyone. It's a few minutes past 2, so let's get started. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. We're very glad you can be here with us to talk about natural gas and decarbonization. This is a subject that has been discussed in a number of NARUC meetings over the past couple of years and in other webinars. And it's part of what I hope is a good long conversation about this topic. The need to decarbonize and reduce greenhouse gas emissions from our energy systems is pretty widely acknowledged. But there's a number of different approaches and strategies being put forth on how to get to the goals we have for 2030 and 2040 and 2050 and beyond. So today we have an excellent panel to provide information on how the natural gas industry is looking at that goal and at those goals of decarbonization. Before we start, I just want to do a couple of quick things. I'm not going to read presenter bios, but they will be here in this presentation, and we'll be sending around a consolidated file that has all the presenters' slides in them after the webinar today. We want to make sure you know about a new course that we're planning as part of NRRI's regulatory training initiative coming up in late September on resource adequacy, another topic of much current interest. And we hope this will help our audience and the regulatory community develop understanding of both some of the fundamentals in resource adequacy and some of the changes and emerging methods that have been coming out. And we've got some folks who are intimately involved in those new methods to talk with us about them. We also want to let you know about events happening from our friends at NARUC Center for Partnership and Innovation and the Center for Electricity Partnership. They've got a number of webinars coming up in the next couple of months, and we hope that you will look at those and consider attending the ones that you find interesting. We love to have your questions. We encourage your questions. Please use the Q&A function rather than the chat function to put those questions in. It helps us keep track of them better. We are going to have relatively short presentations today. We do have 4, but they're all going to be between 10 and 13 minutes. And that will leave plenty of time for us for future questions or questions at the end of the presentation. If there is a question that's really a question of immediate clarification based on something a presenter said, please type that in right away. And if feasible, we'll try to get that clarified right then rather than let that go until the end. But the questions of a larger nature of looking to broaden the subject or ask additional questions will hold until the end for the panel discussion. I think with that, I'm happy to introduce Dr. Susan Stuver from the Gas Technologies Institute, and she's going to talk to us about some of the technological approaches to a zero carbon future. So, Dr. Stuver, it's on you.
Thanks, Jeffrey. Hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to speak on this panel today. And I'm going to just briefly set the stage for the panel and quickly give you an overview of what we consider to be 3 pillars we feel will be key to enabling a low carbon future. Let's go to the next slide. And so the first pillar we're going to talk about is hydrogen, and it's going to be followed by renewable natural gas and finally methane mitigation. Okay, let's move on to the next one. And I'd just like to start by saying that it's really encouraging to see so many of us aligning around the shared vision for a low carbon future. But in order for these technology solutions to be both safe and affordable, we're going to need a really diverse energy portfolio that encompasses multiple forms of energy, whether we're moving electrons via wires or molecules via pipelines. Hydrogen isn't going to replace all of our existing energy sources, but it can be used to significantly decarbonize various economic sectors like heavy industry, transportation, or power generation. And it's important to note how critical collaboration is going to be in advancing the role of hydrogen in our energy system. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So let's think a minute about how we're going to do it. All right, if you look at a typical hydrogen value chain at a high level, like what we've shown in the slide here, it's a lot like the natural gas value chain. We source it, we produce it, and along the way through our delivery system, we need to store it. And finally, we have its performance associated with in-use applications. In order for new technologies to be reliable and resilient, as well as efficient and affordable and accessible, we're going to need to understand how each new innovation will integrate into the hydrogen value chain. And to do that, we need to work together to integrate technologies, understanding how they impact the value chain in a very holistic way. So surrounding the value chain are just a few of the collaboratives that the Hydrogen Technology Center is engaged in some sort of way. In the interest of time, I'm going to just touch on one of them, but I encourage you to reach out if you're interested in hearing more about any of these collaboratives that you see here. Okay, so the one I'm going to talk about is called H2 at Scale, and it's a hydrogen demonstration network that's going on in Texas. The goal of the program is to design, build, and operate a hydrogen infrastructure network that not only integrates on-site renewable hydrogen production, but it also uses hydrogen in various applications. We're going to produce hydrogen via two conversion pathways. The first is via electrolysis, where wind and solar provided by the University of Texas's microgrid provides the power needed for hydrogen production. And the second production pathway is via a small-scale steam methane reformer that uses renewable natural gas as a feedstock. And in total, we plan to generate about 95 kilograms per day of hydrogen. We'll also have on-site storage of hydrogen, on-site fueling station for Toyota Mirai fuel cell cars, and a 100 kilowatt fuel cell that provides backup power for a large data center on the UT campus. The project team's also going to conduct a feasibility study focused on the Port of Houston for scaling up hydrogen production and use. And this location was selected because it's already serving as a base for hydrogen in the US. It produces about a third of the total hydrogen used in the United States annually. It's home to 48 hydrogen production plants, over 900 miles of hydrogen pipelines, and it has a subsurface storage system for hydrogen using salt caverns. So it's a great place to start a hydrogen hub, which can serve as a blueprint for building hydrogen networks in other parts of the country. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so as part of this energy transition, we're faced with these dual imperatives. On the one hand, we've committed to decarbonize, and on the other hand, we still need to grow economically and provide power to homes and industry. So how we begin to balance these dual imperatives will be important as we move forward, meaning that whatever clean energy solutions we integrate must be sufficiently low cost to be adopted by economies of all sizes and maturities in order to achieve the emission reductions needed to meet our climate goals. Initially, it seems to make the most sense to electrify as much as we can, since we can achieve deep decarbonization with electrification. But before we pulled that lever, we first needed to understand if the electrical infrastructure had the capacity to meet our energy demands. So the Department of Energy, the Energy Information Administration, along with academia such as Baylor University and many, many others, began looking at delivery capacity in terms of electric versus gas. And when you look at the delivery capacity in megawatts of an average gas pipeline versus the delivery capacity of average sizes of electrical wires, we're able to meet energy demand 10 to 50 times better with gas than with electric lines. Hence all of the industry enthusiasm around these low carbon gas fuels. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, same goes for storage. Whatever we produce in terms of gigawatts, we need to be able to store it. So the DOE and the EIA also compared energy storage of gas versus electrical and found that in the United States, like 95% of our storage capacity is for gas. Now, that doesn't mean we should give up on things like pumped hydro or battery storage or moving electrons via wires. But what it really comes down to is timing, meaning that in the first decade of this low carbon transition, our storage and delivery infrastructure is way better suited for moving and storing low carbon gas than it is for moving and storing electrons. But different regions will have different needs and infrastructure, so it won't be the same across the board. All right, let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so now that the scientific community has turned its attention in part to low carbon gases such as hydrogen, we need to understand the impacts associated with transitioning to this fuel. And one primary area of R&D around the gas delivery system is mainly associated with pipeline and equipment integrity. Impacts from various hydrogen blends are being investigated on different kinds of pipeline materials and different kinds of equipment found along the way, like compressors, meter sets, seals, regulators, separators, etc. For example, in pipelines, embrittlement happens when hydrogen actually diffuses into the material of the pipe and makes it more brittle, which in turn can make it more susceptible to cracks and leaks. And researchers are currently studying which types of pipe materials and at what pressures will different levels of hydrogen blends begin to see that increased risk of embroilment-related issues. There's also adjustments needed to operations, like hot work, such as welding on pipelines at different hydrogen blends, as well as advancements needed in leak monitoring equipment and associated procedures for leak surveys. Also, codes and standards need adjustment at federal, state, and local levels. Now, we currently have codes and standards for hydrogen, but they're somewhat unconnected and sort of scattered about. So we're developing playbooks for codes and standards that are going to help industry and governments understand how to adjust, consolidate, or edit the codes and standards in a way that makes the most sense. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. All right, I want to touch just a second on in-use. And GTI with organizations such as UC Irvine, utilities, and appliance manufacturers are also investigating the performance of hydrogen blends on residential appliances. And the goal of the work is to observe performance impact on appliances such as ignition issues, stability, flashback, and burner temperatures at different blend ratios. We're also looking at such things as cycling, emissions over performance life of the appliance, and the development of sensing technology. Okay, let's move on to the next one. All right, the next pillar that we're going to talk about is renewable natural gas. And let's take a second to talk about what renewable natural gas is. RNG is essentially biogas that's been processed to purity standards. And biogas, which is not RNG, it's a little bit different. Biogas is produced from various bio-waste sources like food waste, wastewater, agricultural waste, or landfill gas. Then technology like anaerobic digestion or gasification is used to create the RNG that has a gas composition of 95% methane or higher. So it can be seamlessly interchangeable with fossil-derived natural gas. For this fuel, the source of biogas really drives the kind of R&D and technology that the scientific community is exploring. For example, gas that's captured from a landfill can have traces of other gaseous constituents that may need to be monitored for or treated, or may not, depending on the impacts they have throughout the value chain. And on the technology front, there are various digesters and gasification technologies being explored that enhance or improve efficiency, reliability, and cost, as well as technologies that manage the carbon dioxide in some way and or have reduced footprints at larger scales. Since RNG is essentially methane, the real difference comes down to carbon intensity and cost. So let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so this graph demonstrates that the lower the carbon intensity score, the more savings a company can realize with RNG. If you're unfamiliar with carbon intensity or CI scores, it's a measurement of all total hydrocarbons or greenhouse gases emitted versus the amount of energy consumed. The exact units depend on the area of focus, but carbon intensity is generally measured as grams of carbon dioxide equivalent per megajoule of energy or fuel produced. And it's become a relatively simple way of quantifying life cycle greenhouse emission reduction of a product or process. So a company that's trying to reduce their carbon footprint will use CI scores to track their progress. The lower the score, the less your carbon intensity and the better off you are. Depending on the source of RNG, you can get down into those deep negative CI scores, which is where we want to be. Now, moving to the columns to the right of the CI score are some arbitrary costs of RNG per million of BTU. And this graph shows that if you were to get RNG with a score, say, of -250 down there at the bottom, then moving over to the far right column, if RNG were to cost $30 per MMBTU, you could then assume that your cost is going to be about $82 per ton of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions reduced. And if cost of RNG were to come down to, say, $10 per MMBTU, like in that first column there, and you sourced RNG with a CI score of -250, it would then only cost about $21 per ton of carbon dioxide emissions reduced. And another way to look at it is in terms of displacing carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. For example, 3 billion cubic feet of RNG with a CI score of, let's say, -60 will displace carbon dioxide equivalent emissions of 6 billion cubic feet of natural gas, so roughly double. So RNG holds a lot of promise and a lot of value. So let's take a look at some of the technical challenges and associated research in this space. And for RNG, It's about understanding how much trace constituents can be allowed to stay within the gas, how to monitor them, and how to mitigate them if needed. So all the R&D excitement is currently around the interconnect, where RNG enters the natural gas pipeline, and the source, as well as the volume of biogas, is going to dictate exactly what type of monitoring equipment might be needed. For example, if you get biogas from a municipal landfill, you may need different monitoring and gas upgrading equipment at the interconnect than, say, biogas from wood waste or agriculture. But for the most part, typical equipment needed at the interconnect are going to be things like moisture and oxygen analyzers, gas chromatographs to calculate heating value, hydrogen sulfide monitoring. There's a variety of temperature and pressure sensors, separators, and most importantly, we need isolation valves and auto shutoff systems for both safety and to maintain gas quality. Okay, let's move on to methane mitigation. Let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so even in the shadow of the growing excitement around RNG and hydrogen, we still have growing interest, and rightly so, in methane mitigation. So where we're at in this space is advancing beyond incremental R&D projects to create holistic solutions that support these diverse energy landscapes of the future. Methane emission detection, quantification, and mitigation technology has all become very advanced. In addition to the methane sensors being integrated into global positioning and meteorological sensors, there's also rapid development in the space of artificial intelligence and machine learning that can create real-time analytics, dashboards, and smart maps that show you the leaks right on the tablet as they're happening. So with all this complexity and rapid innovation, we recognize how important it is to share skill sets and knowledge across our partnerships with industry, academia, national labs, and policymakers. And if you're interested in learning more about methane mitigation and our many collaboratives in this space, it's worth attending our Methane Connections Conference. It's going to be happening October 12th and 13th in Fort Collins, Colorado. And the theme this year is accelerating transition to a low carbon world. Let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so according to the Energy Information Administration, the outlook for emission reduction in natural gas looks pretty good. It shows that although production in oil and gas has increased, along with the consumption of natural gas, emissions from carbon dioxide, methane, and NOx are still coming down. That's great, but we can do better, and we're going to need to if we're going to hit our decarbonization goals by 2030 and beyond. Let's move on to the next slide. Okay. So we spend a great deal of time in R&D working towards solutions in methane technology development, technology evaluation, modeling, improving methodologies for technology use in the lab and in the field, and of course, collecting data and field testing technologies through measurement campaigns. The columns with the pictures break it down even further. For example, if we're focused on the technology itself, we may be developing novel types of methane sensors, which can be designed to detect emission sources, quantify emission rates, analyze gases, or some combination of the three. We also investigate the performance of methane sensors based on the platform they're affixed to, such as handhelds, vehicles, robots, drones, aircraft, or satellites. And we also need to be aware that the types of infrastructure being surveyed for methane emissions or being improved with new technology will have a bearing on the types of sensors that work best or the methods that need to be deployed. For example, a technology that might work great for a leak investigation of a pipeline may not be ideal for a compressor station or a meter set. And this leads us to understanding the use cases or the methods that work best for methane leak detection based on the objective of the user, the kinds of sensors and platforms being used, as well as the types of assets being surveyed. Okay, to wrap it up and set the stage for the rest of the panelists. Although promising pathways exist, we still need a number of technology advancements to achieve global decarbonization goals. And that will include things such as low carbon fuels like hydrogen and RNG coupled with methane mitigation and electrification where it might make sense. And with that, we'll need to produce, store, and deliver these diverse forms of low carbon energy in a way that's affordable, resilient, and provides equal access across all of our communities. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jeff to introduce the next panelists. And thanks again, everyone.
Thank you, Sue. That was outstanding. There's so much great information in there, and it's so obvious from your enthusiasm that there's a lot more you would like to talk about. Maybe we'll have to have something a little more detailed on some of these technologies because
there's 7 hours or so. Just yeah, we can go over some.
And I'm sure people have questions based on all the great information in there. So please put them into the Q&A now while you're thinking of them. And continue to do so we can get them lined up for for Sue and the rest of the panelists at the end. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Richard Meyer with American Gas Association. Richard, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Jeff, and I really appreciate the opportunity to present here today. And on the heels of Dr. Stuver's presentation, I think the audience will see probably a lot of overlap. I might characterize or categorize even some of these opportunities with a slight tweak, but largely seeing the opportunities the same way. Just real briefly, I'm responsible for our energy markets analysis and codes and standards group at AGA, and AGA continues to do a lot of analysis and work with its members to demonstrate those opportunities for natural gas utilities on those pathways to a significantly lower carbon energy economy. Next slide. Our starting point is that AGA and its membership understands and appreciates the need to mitigate the impacts of climate change, and we start with the recognition that there is already a strong track record of this industry of reducing greenhouse gas emissions across all sectors of the economy. AGA is committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions through smart innovation, new and modernized infrastructure, and advanced technologies, so that we can maintain reliable, resilient, and affordable energy service choices for customers. I'll point to that commitment, our climate change position statement. This includes a set of commitments for reducing emissions and 8 principles for an effective national policy approach to addressing climate change. Many of the topical areas, technologies, ideas that I'll talk about in the rest of my presentation and in the panel discussion today are also touched on this position statement. You can access that, the link on the slide here. As business makers, as policymakers, as businesses, as policymakers and stakeholders develop and implement strategies to pursue a significantly lower carbon energy economy, natural gas utilities are committed to doing their part. And AGA and the nation's natural gas utilities are committed to delivering natural gas cleanly and more efficiently, and to utilizing our infrastructure to distribute the energy sources of the future. Next slide. Achieving our nation's ambitious emissions reduction goals while also enhancing the resilience of the energy system will require a coordinated strategy that leverages all of the different opportunities available to us. Indeed, the key here is to address carbon while also addressing cost, resilience, and recognizing that customers want control and choice of their energy. AGA and our team, we continue to study and assess different proposals to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, in particular how emerging natural gas technologies can contribute to meaningful reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. And our work highlights how greenhouse gas emissions reductions can be achieved at significantly lower costs compared to some of the proposals out today through integrating innovative gas solutions while offering customers more choices, and again, that improved affordability, reliability, and resilience of our energy. Next slide, please. There are various approaches to reducing gas utility emissions, and I'll focus on that aspect here. And when I'm talking about gas utility emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, I'm talking about both operations and from the energy delivered by gas utilities to customers. There's likely more ways to characterize these approaches or these strategies, but to me, the approaches for gas utilities really fall into 4 key categories. 1, energy efficiency and reducing the overall energy demand through energy efficiency programs and the use of high efficiency or advanced gas technologies. 2, the use of low carbon gases. And here we meet demand through the use of gases that reduce the carbon intensity of energy delivered by gas utilities. I'll go into more of these opportunities in a second, but really what we're talking about is renewable natural gas, hydrogen, a methanated hydrogen, also sometimes called synthetic hydrogen. A lot of key opportunities we can drive into a little bit more detail in a minute. Methane emission reductions are key as well as the third category. I'm not going to focus too much of my time or presentation today on this one, and Dr. Stuver already did cover some of the good work over at GTI underway on this, but there's a lot of effort across the industry to reduce direct utility emissions associated with operations, but also the use of strategies to reduce upstream methane emissions and CO2 emissions associated with the production delivery of natural gas. And of course, working to identify low methane sources of gas and incentivizing the use of that gas through various mechanisms. Finally, carbon management. Here, we're talking about negative emissions technologies, even the use of greenhouse gas emissions offsets. Another category here I'm not going to spend too much time on, but there's a lot of work underway to understand this potential. And what we're talking about here, again, is the use of carbon capture and sequestration, direct air capture, nature-based solutions, and greenhouse gas emissions offsets, as I said. Next slide, please. More research and development is necessary for continued improvement in next generation natural gas technologies, particularly those end-use technologies to improve energy efficiency and reduce demand. In 2019, the American Gas Foundation completed a study examining the opportunities for reducing greenhouse gas emissions through emerging natural gas direct use technologies. What we found, what the foundation found through this report, was that widespread adoption of emerging natural gas direct use technologies, so using natural gas directly for cooking, home heating, and clothes drying, could contribute significantly to achieving deep reductions in greenhouse gas emissions in the US residential sector at potentially much lower costs than other options under consideration. And these technologies include high efficiency gas appliances available today and other direct use technologies that are expected to roll out to the market within 2, maybe 3 years. And here we might think about the gas heat pump for space, even water heating is a key opportunity here. Next slide, please. I've mentioned renewable gases and renewable natural gas. Here, AGA defines renewable natural gas as a pipeline-compatible gaseous fuel, which is derived from biogenic or other renewable sources that has a lower life cycle carbon dioxide equivalent emissions compared to geologic natural gas. It reduces GHG, and it's compatible with the current system. Next slide, please. About 18 months ago, the American Gas Foundation completed a comprehensive analysis on renewable natural gas resources in the US. As RNG interest was growing, AGA members, the Board of Trustees of the American Gas Foundation as well, wanted to take a closer look at just how much RNG could be produced in the US, and importantly, what are the greenhouse gas emissions reduction potential associated with those resources. What that study found is that there is indeed a significant RNG resource potential available in this country. And importantly, it's not geographically limited. Of course, the production of RNG sources will vary by region, but there is a diverse supply of feedstocks and a diversity of production technologies that makes this a great renewable energy option for all regions of the country. Before I move off of RNG and renewable gas, RNG here, let me say that we've been doing more work examining this resource potential. And I'm not ready to share it today, but let me leave you with a couple initial observations I've had through that ongoing work. One, the more you look at different gas decarbonization opportunities, the more potential you realize there is to unlock. And two, the increased policy focus of net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, based on that rubric as a goal, I would suggest that there's even likely more potential for renewable gases than what was examined here in this 2019 study, which had some conservative assumptions and was only extended out through 2040. So I think there's a lot more potential to unlock is the idea I want to leave you with here. Next slide. I'll go through this quickly. We can put these various studies into context and compare the emissions reductions and importantly, the cost associated with those emissions reductions into a comparative context. And what I'm trying to say is that highly efficient direct use gas technologies can cost effectively reduce emissions, and the use of renewable natural gases can cost effectively reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide. Recognizing there's potential, there's been a lot of action from US utilities and policymakers to advance renewable gases as an opportunity. AGA has been tracking RNG related activity for more than 2 years now. And when we first started, we only had about 18 states colored on this map. Now we have a majority of the states in the US that have engaged and witnessed some sort of activity to promote the use of RNG in the building sector. And that has been a lot of our focus, the use of RNG in the residential commercial sector as a key opportunity. All of this information, I should say, is available on AGA's website. The next slide. Hydrogen is a key opportunity, and the gas system's ability to integrate those carbon neutral sources of energy like renewable gas and hydrogen are critical components of our nation's ability to reach ambitious greenhouse gas reduction goals. And natural gas utilities have a crucial interest to ensure that hydrogen can be integrated into gas storage and delivery systems and utilized in end-use applications, and that process is done safely and reliably. And the natural gas utility industry supports international research efforts to better understand the full scope of hydrogen impacts on pipelines. And that includes what we just heard about, from blending low percentages of hydrogen into existing gas pipelines to even constructing dedicated hydrogen systems that utilize 100% hydrogen in different applications. Gas utilities are piloting hydrogen production technologies to evaluate the impacts on the system and direct use equipment. And we heard already some of that from Dr. Stuver. And many gas utilities have begun to incorporate hydrogen into their emission reduction strategies while educating policymakers, regulators, and customers on their plans for a hydrogen-enabled gas system. Next slide. There's several types of policies or regulatory considerations that will be needed to unlock these opportunities and this potential. And indeed, gas utilities can't do this on their own. As regulated companies, these companies will need support from policymakers and approval from regulators and customers. Policy and regulatory support for the production and use of low carbon gases will be necessary, and in particular, the need for policy parity to enable the use of renewable natural gas in the building sector is key. Research, development, and deployment of key technologies will be needed too. That includes renewable gases, but also the advancement of efficient gas technologies, and to examine the implications of integrating new energy sources into the gas distribution system. AGA is rooted in credible analysis and the facts, and part of our job is to educate policymakers, regulators, customers, and other groups on those opportunities and those challenges associated with various pathways to achieve a significantly lower carbon energy economy. And we're going to need to scale these technologies and understand the implications of transforming pipeline and end-use equipment to accommodate some of these new opportunities. And finally, the last bullet here, attracting and retaining talent. The workforce development opportunities are significant, but time, resources will be needed to continue to attract and retain talent to realize these opportunities. My last slide here is that as companies continue to modernize our natural gas infrastructure and connect homes and businesses to the system, new opportunities arise to achieve low-cost greenhouse gas emissions reductions by leveraging new and existing gas infrastructure through advanced technologies and our nation's abundant natural gas resources. And additionally, gas infrastructure can be used for renewable energy storage and the delivery of renewable gases from biogenic sources and zero carbon electricity. And indeed, the gas system's ability to integrate these high value sources of energy will be critical components of our nation's ability to reach ambitious greenhouse gas reduction goals. We are committed to collaborating with local policymakers, federal regulators, Congress, the Biden administration to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through the innovation, modernized infrastructure, and advanced technologies to achieve those goals of reliability, resilience, and affordability for customers. And with that, I look forward to the panel presentation, or rather the panel discussion to come. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Richard. Very much appreciated. I think that was an excellent follow-on to Dr. Stuver's presentation and provided some good additional context. And also a nice lead into our next presentation from Melissa Adams from Washington Gas Light, who can talk about some of the steps that an actual utility is taking to use some of these strategies and look forward to some of these technologies and how they see their future as a utility in a decarbonizing world. So Melissa, I will turn it over to you and move to your first slide. It's all yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you NRRI for this invitation to participate in this very important topical discussion. And so I'm Melissa Adams. I'm Chief Corporate Social Responsibility Officer for Washington Gas. And Washington Gas was chartered by an act of Congress in 1848 to light the Capitol Dome and provide street lighting in the District of Columbia. And we have been evolving ever since. Today, we serve over 1.2 million customers in the District of Columbia and the adjacent suburbs of Maryland and Virginia. And most of our delivery goes to residential and commercial customers. Next slide, please. I'd like to thank Dr. Stuver and Richard for really setting an excellent foundation that I can build on with respect to my remarks today. And I am going to be focusing on our climate business plan that we developed for the District of Columbia that was created to provide a framework to support the achievement of the District of Columbia's very bold climate goals, which include a 50% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2032 and carbon neutrality by 2050. Not only does our plan support the district's goals, we mirrored these same goals on GHG reduction for our own operations and for the product we deliver to our customers as well. And so part of our effort involved retaining the consulting firm ICF to help us with technical expertise, which included an evaluation of opportunities provided by biofuels or renewable natural gas as well. And we actually have a companion document that describes the findings with respect to renewable natural gas opportunities. Next slide, please. Our plan is unique in that it sought to assign very specific reductions to specific categories of activity. And though we recognize there's a great deal of uncertainty due to evolving conditions and breakthrough technologies that are emerging, these could, again, materially affect our assumptions and outcomes. The plan is also unique in that it created scenarios to contrast and compare different pathways. The pathway that supports our climate business plan utilizes a fuel neutral decarbonization scenario, which retains the important benefits of our highly reliable and resilient natural gas infrastructure that also preserves affordability. We also did embrace some of the benefits of electrification in our plan as well. The plan itself identifies reduction opportunities in three important categories. One, customer end use. Two, emissions relating to our pipeline distribution system and operations. And three, reduction opportunities related to fuel sourcing and supply. Next slide, please. We layered in each of these tactics over time, sort of leveraging ready now and lower cost opportunities like energy efficiency, utilization of combined heat and power, advanced leak detection, and distribution system pipe modernization. And then we move throughout the continuum, layering in things like no carbon gas sourcing, beginning pretty aggressively in the middle term, and hybrid heating and gas and electric systems, and then ultimately layering in future sources, as has previously been discussed, like hydrogen. Next slide, please. So this is just a sort of blown up snapshot of where we see our future resources coming from with respect to supply. And we see tremendous opportunity for reductions in the sourcing of gaseous fuels. And they leverage the benefits, again, of our existing and reliable infrastructure, and don't really create burdens for our customers with respect to having to change equipment, and also preserve customer choice. Our plan foresees sourcing most of our fossil gas with certified suppliers, and those would be extractors that adhere to best practices that lower emissions associated with the extraction of that gas, and that then can produce certification and or real-time measurements to verify that reduced greenhouse gas emission. We're also foreseeing blending in both regionally and nationally sourced biofuel or renewable natural gas, a process that we started this summer when we proposed to connect to a regional wastewater facility. And the idea, again, is to transform locally produced waste streams into useful energy, capturing that energy from sources that might otherwise be flared or emitted to the atmosphere or trucked hundreds of miles away for disposal. And just as an example, in our Maryland operating territory, it was recently estimated that local landfills account for about 37% of Maryland's methane emissions. So we believe that repurposing these sources and using them for useful energy production is really a terrific idea. And as Richard mentioned, we're pretty encouraged about the resources that are available and emerging. Next slide, please. We also plan to bring down the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the delivery of natural gas to our customers. Accelerated pipeline replacement programs have reduced our Scope 1 emissions by about 12% already, and we expect that trend to continue over the next 10 years, again, assuming the continuation of these programs that also, again, enhance reliable and safe operations. We're also planning to pilot satellite technology to determine its benefits in more quickly and efficiently identifying system leaks and then rapidly addressing them through repair. We'll also continue our aggressive outreach efforts to avoid third-party damages and strikes to our system, which are also a source of emissions. And the other thing I failed to mention is that we are also very interested and have begun using drawdown compressors, both miniature ones that we've developed ourselves in-house and larger compressor to capture gas rather than vent it during repair and replacement activity. Next slide, please. So while Scope 1 emissions related to the distribution of natural gas to our customers are relatively small, emissions associated with natural gas use are larger. So we are very focused on energy efficiency and reducing Scope 3 emissions that way, as well as the sourcing and supply that I mentioned. But our plan calls for a number of very aggressive steps to significantly improve energy efficiency and reduce these emissions while also preserving affordability by bringing down energy costs and use. Next slide, please. Among the strategies that we envision are expanded energy efficiency programs that incentivize customers to use high efficiency equipment, outreach and behavioral programs that have proven to lower usage, and pilot programs that would advance high efficiency new technologies like gas heat pumps that offer many benefits. They preserve energy resiliency while significantly reducing energy use. And we're especially interested in some of the technologies that are self-powering, meaning that if or when electricity goes out, say during extreme weather conditions, these devices can power themselves and continue to operate. We're also seeking to promote highly efficient uses of combined heat and power, perhaps again using renewable natural gas. And these offer great benefits as well with respect to resiliency and energy efficiency, while also reducing demand on the grid. Finally, we plan to advance hybrid heating by partnering with electric heat pump technologies that would then be backed up with furnace use when the weather gets cold, rather than pulling on the grid during those times of peak demand. It's important to note that in our footprint, our gas infrastructure delivers 60% more energy on the coldest days of the year than the electric grid does provide on the hottest days of the year. So hybrids, combined heat and power, can help support electrification where it makes sense, while not overburdening the electric system to do something perhaps it was not necessarily designed to do to serve a winter peak. And serving, again, winter peak with renewable sources can be even more difficult and expensive. And we are very supportive of renewable electricity. And in fact, it is one of the key decarbonization strategies for the District of Columbia, but burdening it with even more demand might not be the most useful pathway. So anyway, in our climate business plan, we also sought to price the cost of different carbon neutrality pathways that were specific to the District of Columbia. And so we developed a business as usual scenario that includes the district's 100% RPS program by 2032. And then we compared different pathways and scenarios to that baseline. And so one was something we called partial decarbonization. It was relatively inexpensive, but again, it did not hit the targets that the district is seeking to accomplish. So we got to about an 80% reduction there rather inexpensively. But like most programs, when you seek to squeeze the final remaining bits of carbon or greenhouse gases out of the system, things do get more expensive. And what we found was that the fuel neutral decarbonization pathway, which would leverage existing gas infrastructure, is far less expensive than a policy-driven electrification pathway that would require a full-scale fuel switching. We found that the total program cost for a fuel neutral decarbonization pathway was about $2.7 billion less in aggregate over time than the alternative decarbonization pathway. And again, among the cost drivers for the policy-driven case were, full-scale substitution of thermal equipment, building wiring, panel upgrades, and the relatively higher cost of electricity. And the modeling was rather conservative. It did not try to cost any incremental additions to the local electric grid that are likely to be required to support the energy demands of full electrification, including the vehicle electrification that is also being simultaneously pursued. The modeling also did not attempt to price or forecast the potential for rising costs related to upstream transmission infrastructure or potential increases in highly valued renewable electricity production. And finally, we did not quantify either the benefits or costs or risks of shifting a multi-fueled energy system to a system that might be solely dependent on a single fuel source. Next slide. And the plan was, recognized by folks like the Environmental Defense Fund with respect to its holistic nature and long-term thinking and sort of integrated resource planning considerations. Next slide, please. And if you are interested in finding out more, we do have a microsite, and that is Washington Gas DC climatebusinessplan.com, where we have the business plan provided, as well as the technical study on renewable natural gas potential, as well as recordings and videos of the public meetings that we hold every 6 months to discuss our progress and answer questions and discuss issues with our stakeholders. And then there are also a number of other resources. So with that, I thank you and look forward to the Q&A session.
Thank you, Melissa. I appreciate that. Again, great to hear how a utility is taking these available approaches and trying to make them, make them operational and fit into your long-term business plan. And that brings us to Chairwoman Fedorchak, who is chair of the North Dakota Commission and has the job that she signed up for herself to take all that you've heard so far and tie it up and give her thoughts on how she as a regulator and how she thinks, I hope the rest of the regulatory community can use this information and thinking about how they make their decisions and look at policy. So Chairwoman, the floor is yours for that.
Excellent. Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate that. And like Jeff said, I am just the wrap-up person, and so I don't have any formal slides, so you get to look at me up close for the next few minutes while I offer some thoughts. So what an exciting time we live in. It's just amazing how many changes are occurring just across the board in the energy sector, and it's exciting, and it's also really challenging. And so I just want to highlight a couple of the points that the previous presenters made that I think are particularly important, and things that regulators like myself, regardless of where we live, I think really focus on. So as a regulator, I view my role as really primarily two things, focusing first and foremost on ensuring reliability, so that the customers who are paying for these services have the services available to support their everyday lives and their businesses. And then secondly, making sure that the system is affordable, so people can affordably pay for their bills, pay for these essential services, and that the business community that provides the foundation for our whole economy can also afford the power services and energy services that are essential for them to function and support our communities. So those are the two big goals that we cannot take our eyes off of as regulators. Within that, I think it's important to acknowledge firsthand, as our speakers have, that natural gas is here for the immediate and long-term future. Like the system is really dependent on natural gas. And I'm not saying just straight natural gas. There's some new fuels that are coming on board, and those offer exciting potential. But natural gas is what we have today that's affordable and reliable, and we need to not take our eye off of that or turn our back on that. And if you want to look at what our country looks like without natural gas, we did get a sneak peek at that this winter in February, and where much of Texas and throughout the Midwest had severe natural gas shortages. And in the middle of winter, when natural gas is needed the most and is essential to reliability. And look at what happened when we didn't have it. And that was not a very pretty picture. It's not sustainable either. There was a lot of loss of life, there was loss of property, and there was increased costs for millions of ratepayers throughout the central part of the U.S. Well, North Dakota, where I live and work, we had reliable service. We didn't lose. We had a little bit of rolling outages on the electric side, but our natural gas service was reliable and it was there for our customers. But those customers in my state are paying hundreds of dollars more for the next year to cover the costs related to the lack of supply during some of that time. So we really need to acknowledge that we are dependent on natural gas and we have to maintain that system. And so that's one of the essentials. I think as we move forward, understanding both reliability and cost, one of the things, and I think it was Melissa right at the end who talked a bit about the importance of the winter season. And I think that's one of the things that we've learned recently. The electric system or the electric industry was really focused on summer peak and has been for a long time. And what I think we're seeing as we innovate and change and reimagine the future is that when we're relying more on natural gas and the dual use of that in the winter for home heating and electric production, we really need to focus our planning, acknowledging that seasonal component and making sure that we have the supply and the systems to deliver that fuel in the winter, when dealing without it really does result in a loss of life and significant damage to property. So that's one of the things I think we really all need to work together on, is refocusing a bit on the winter season and the planning for that and for those particular needs. Another thing that I think we have to recognize and face is that we need more infrastructure, even to support the hydrogen future, the renewable natural gas. We need more pipelines in the ground to deliver those fuels. And the new pipelines that are being built or the old ones that are being redelivered, we need to look at making those compatible and investing in those for the long haul, like Susan was talking. The products are different, the impact, the pipe's a little different. We need to better understand that and make sure that we're accommodating that as much as we can as soon as possible to pave the way for the future. I think what regulators really prefer the most is the no regrets approach. So let's make the investments that we need to ensure reliability today and to pave the path for these new exciting fuels in the future. And so in that pipeline investment, that's one of the things we need to look at, regardless of what kind of fuels are going to be moving through the pipe. Another of the no regrets is the energy efficiency. Melissa talked a lot about that in the plan that her company is looking at, improving efficiency and the use. Richard mentioned that too. There's some highly efficient new natural gas technologies that can reduce emissions by up to 40% just with some of the better technologies for appliances, etc. Those are all the types of things, the low-hanging fruit that we need to get the most out of the existing system that we have and the existing technologies and pave the way for the new ones as well. So those are another thing. And then what Susan was talking about was the methane reductions. We can make sure that the existing pipelines that we have in the ground today and any new ones that are built in the future use some of that new technology to reduce the emissions and make it as efficient and as clean as possible long term. So those are some of the other important pieces that I think we all can agree on and embrace and move forward with together, regardless of where you stand on specific technologies. I think what struck me the most was Melissa's comment right at the end, where she showed the difference in cost with the fuel neutral approach versus the heavy-handed electrification, and how many millions of dollars. I think she even said 2 billion. I didn't quite catch the exact amount, but in difference in cost there. So let's, I hope that we can all find the common ground that we have in as we walk down this pathway together, find some of those common ground policy agreements that we can reach to move forward, row in the same direction, get there in a reliable, responsible, cost-effective way, and worry less about the timelines and more about maintaining the reliability and moving consistently forward in a sustainable way towards this pathway to a greener future. So those are some of the initial thoughts I had. I know that we're coming up after 2 o'clock and wanted to leave plenty of time for questions. So I will turn it back to you, Jeff, and welcome and entertain any questions folks will have.
Thank you very much, Chairwoman. I think you did an excellent job so picking out the highlights from all the discussions we had. And I'm sure we can have some further discussion. We're getting a few questions in that that we'll go over, and I've got some questions prepared as well. But if the panel could come back on so that we can see you all and hear what you have to say in response to some of these questions. I wanted to sort of going back to the beginning, and I hope it'll be refreshed, and maybe I'll try to put the slide up as well. I want to ask a question of you, Dr. Stuver, about the issue of the carbon intensity of natural gas, renewable natural gas, and I'm going to put that back up on the screen here. Can you help us understand a little bit about what's feasible right now in terms of carbon intensity reductions? You've got a table that goes down to a -250, and you provide an example over here of what happens at -60. Just very briefly, what does it take to get to -60? What does it take to get to -250? Is that feasible now? And if so, how and why, and what's the basis and the difference between getting to one level versus another? You have to
There you go. I think that comes down to how the gas is actually sourced. So if you're taking gas out of a natural process, like say agriculture, and I don't have off the top of my head which processes give you the best bang for your buck in carbon scores, but I do know that carbon intensity scores I've seen some drop as low as like -400. The general rule is the more that you can take it out of the natural system where the methane would have been emitted anyway as part of a natural process, like say manure or something like that, then the lower the score you're going to get. So in other words, the better you're going to be, right? So the more reduced your carbon intensity is. And I don't know if we want to introduce Dan Lefevers. I know he's done some research in this topic, and I see him here as a panelist. He might add some clarification or weigh in, but
I can do that, Susan. Thank you.
Please, thank you, Dan.
So in general, when you're looking at methane mitigation, say a dairy digester that's displacing, say, an open lagoon of manure at a dairy site, so you're eliminating natural methane emissions from the manure. You're capturing that methane, and then you're going to be burning it in something, right? You're going to be utilizing it. And of course, you're reducing methane emissions and replacing them with just straight CO2 emissions. And as you know, pure methane emissions just escaping are much stronger than CO2 emissions. So that's how you get these low scores. I think a good place to maybe look is the California Air Resources Board website. And they have a very interesting, very long, big table of all the scores that they've done for about 1,093 different fuels used in transportation. The other way that you can get low scores is in general just sequestering biogenic CO2. So if you look at woody biomass, for example, which is viewed as carbon neutral because that waste wood, if you're using waste wood, and that's what everybody utilizes in talking about moving forward with making renewable natural gas from gasification, that wood is eventually going to rot and create methane and CO2 emissions. And obviously it took CO2 out of the air. So it's viewed by scientists as carbon neutral. So when you take biogenic CO2 and sequester it, you can also get negative CI scores as low as about a negative 100. So there are opportunities, and I guess the other option would be even with landfill gas, if you were to take that CO2 and sequester it or utilize it in some way, you could get to negative CI scores also. So as we look to new technologies and new processes, identifying means and opportunities to get negative CI scores into the natural gas system will exponentially reduce CO2 emissions for that system. So I hope that helps.
No, thank you, Dan. That's very helpful. I appreciate that. Thanks for weighing in. Anybody else is certainly welcome to weigh in, but I think Dan covered that pretty well. So I wanted to keep some of the questions going. On this idea of renewable natural gas, and I think this is a topic that a lot of people are finding interesting. I think there's a lot of sort of different questions about it. One question I had, Richard, you used the term policy parity for renewable natural gas. And I wondered if you could just speak briefly about what that means to AGA, what you're talking about there, and particularly Chairwoman Fedorchak, if that, feel free to pick up on that as it's more of a policy regulatory question. But Richard, could you expand on that for a minute, please?
It's a great question, and where to start here? With regard to renewable natural gas, there are both federal and different state incentives for the production and in some cases use of renewable natural gas. However, those incentives for the use of RNG are largely focused on the transportation sector and in some cases in the power generation sector. And right now there's a policy gap with regard to RNG use in buildings. And so policy parity or filling that policy gap might be another way to put it, is to recognize that this is an opportunity for emissions reductions, but it will require policy support and incentives, as we have seen with other types of renewable energy technologies and other technologies that have received support in other parts of the economy. Just recognizing too that RNG as a resource is going to cost more than geologic natural gas. But that's not quite the right comparison in my view. The comparison is, how does RNG as a resource, as a strategy, how does that compare in terms of cost effectiveness of reducing emissions compared to other potential strategies that have been offered or on the table for consideration? And that's the right comparison, I would argue. And then how do we consider incentivizing that so that customers in the building sector have those opportunities for use of RNG? I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you. Chairwoman, please.
I could offer just actually, I had kind of cued in on that same slide or point that Richard had laid out on the policy issues on RNG. And I think this is probably an area where other regulators like myself need to better understand, where is it not, where are they not on parity in terms of using in buildings and et cetera. Is there technical, legal changes that need to be made from a safety standpoint? What's not on parity in terms of using the renewable natural gas versus normal natural gas in the sectors that you've talked about? So I would need to better understand that, because that was not something that I'm familiar with. And then my state was one of those in your map that was still white. So we don't have any specific initiatives to encourage renewable natural gas, and there was a whole bunch of other states in the Midwest that also are similar to mine. But we are the states that were still white are a lot of agriculture, ranching, states where there's probably a good opportunity for renewable natural gas. So finding ways to tap into that, I know that our governor is excited about those opportunities, and so there's a lot of rich potential here to turn that crap into something more valuable. So I think that we should look into, you know, how to make that feasible on a large scale.
Thank you. Does anybody else have anything they wanted to add on that in terms of the policy? And maybe Richard, is there a resource that either AJ has or is thinking about making available to regulators to answer some of the Chairwoman's questions?
So going back to the map, we are tracking activities. Different states have taken different approaches. Some have passed legislation. Others are examining regulatory approaches, for example, making renewable natural gas available as an option to customers through tariffs. And then there's other variations on these themes. There's also work underway within our team to examine what those legislative, really what I should say, the policy and regulatory strategies and frameworks that will be necessary to capture these opportunities. And I think it gets to Madam Chair's point right there about what's really needed to fill these policy gaps, what creative thinking's been done or still needs to be done to capture this opportunity. And importantly, it's a real opportunity to solve greenhouse gas emissions issues in a couple of different places in the economy. And specifically, we're talking about our agricultural communities and capturing this waste and reducing emissions at that stage, while offering customers a lower carbon energy resource at that stage. And so this is really a win-win across the economy. And so more work to be done there. But I would refer to our RNG tracking document, which is available on the AGA website. There's a lot of good resources there for the audience and others to tap into.
Thanks. I have some questions from the audience, and I want to make sure we get to as many of those as possible, even though I have a lot of questions myself. A question for you, Melissa, related to utility operations, and I think you touched on this, but question is, if a utility is replacing distribution lines, and Chairwoman Fedorchak, you kind of hit on this, if you're replacing distribution lines to either improve system efficiency or reduce emissions, or maybe they're just at their end of life, are utilities looking to replace those with materials that are capable of transporting higher percentages of hydrogen or RNG with some of these other trace constituents or contaminants, if you call them that Dr. Stuver mentioned? Is that ready for prime time? Is that ready to go in the ground yet, or is that still too far out? How is the utility looking at those opportunities?
Well, in our case, the RNG standards and interconnection standards that we are establishing are such that the renewable natural gas that we would introduce would be compatible with our system and pipeline quality. So for RNG resources, we don't see any difference. And, we have quite tight testing, that with shutoffs and everything else, so that, we wouldn't accept the gas if it doesn't absolutely meet our standards for safety and compatibility. With respect to hydrogen, that's a little different for us, and we foresee that a little further in the future for some of the reasons that you mentioned, and for some of the like getting to some of the programming that Dr. Stuver mentioned at GTI. So we're really interested in exploring and being involved more in safety issues and embrittlement issues. And I think there's some interesting work in technology research that's been conducted with respect to pressure and temperature that appears to solve some of the issues. But even in our case, and in the cases that I'm aware of, the blending that is occurring is at a fairly low level. So at this point, we see currently like 1% blending. I think what I hear about in other places, maybe in the EU, is maybe up to 10, 12%. But I would really it's something we're keeping our eye on, and I would really encourage and appreciate support from, our regulatory partners in supporting that research and in making sure that we can accommodate safely and reliably these really impressive sources of zero carbon gas.
Thank you. And to pick up on some of the other questions, there was a question asked earlier, and Dr. Stuver answered it sort of in the Q&A window, but I'll point people to it. And there was a question about hydrogen and whether or not there's any publications coming out by GTI about some of these compatibility issues. And she referred folks to the Low Carbon Resources Initiative website, and maybe we can drop that in the chat to everybody and point everybody to that, because it's not clear to us if answered questions are visible to everyone. So I don't know, maybe Catherine, if that's something you could grab and put in the chat for everyone. Thank you for that reference, Dr. Stuver. There was another question related to RNG about, I read it as a question sort of about the scale and scaling up infrastructure. The question was, are there opportunities or even any examples of sharing facilities for RNG or biomethane in terms of testing, in terms of processing? I think this question is getting at, before it gets blended into the pipeline. And so, Dr. Stuver, I know you answered that a little bit. If you could maybe just touch on that briefly.
Sure. It's in California, they're capturing and transporting some biogas through basically a shared pipeline system, and it goes to one cleanup injection location at the natural gas pipeline. So they're using it as a way to tie dairy farms together. And I'll kick it over to anyone else. I think AGA may have, I don't, Richard, if you're specifically involved in it, but I know AGA has been involved in that. Or if anyone else is familiar with it, weigh in.
I have heard of the project. I'm not deeply familiar with it. I kind of imagine it as a wheel and spoke type configuration that is able to connect many different resources to, as you said, the similar infrastructure. And just from the analysis that our team's done, and from the groups we've worked with on the RNG resource assessment, that's an example of a type of technological innovation that's happened just recently that is changing minds and considerations about how much economic resource potential is available to capture over time. And so that's quite frankly part of the reason why I made my comment earlier that the more you look at some of these challenges or opportunities, the more potential can be unlocked. And that's a key example of that. So I appreciate you bringing that up.
Oh, Jeff, you're muted.
Yep, I was muted. Thank you both. Kind of in a related direction, and coming back to Chairwoman Fedorchak, your point about the near term and the middle term and the need for natural gas, and again, I think we'll go to Melissa as well. Are you finding that you need to or want to make assessments of the likely timeline or useful life of new gas infrastructure? If we're envisioning a future where we're going to go really all in on hydrogen, for example, and a lot of some of the pipelines or some of the distribution lines are going to need to be replaced, for example, or fewer of them are needed in some places because of balancing, finding the right balance of where electrification makes sense, where gas still makes sense, et cetera. How do you think about that timeline and the useful life of that infrastructure so that you can make decisions where you do get the most use out of it and don't don't want to retire it before you've covered the cost of it?
Sure. Yeah, that is a really important question. When I look at this, I look at, the average useful life of pipelines can be, 30 to 50 years, maybe beyond with additional O&M. But if you look at, the future usage for natural gas and a lot of the studies, it shows that we're going to be needing this for a good 30 years still. So I personally think that the concerns about the viability of these infrastructure investments in the near term are premature, especially in any of the northern climates where you depend heavily on natural gas for home heating in the winter. There was a question earlier I saw that said, when considering electrification as an alternative to natural gas, what's contemplated as a fuel source to generate that? Well, we're largely dependent on still dispatchable resources to back up the renewables in the winter and in the summer, quite honestly. But they provide a vast majority of the electricity in large swaths of time, and that's a very legitimate concern. If your goal is reduced emissions, you're going to be better off using natural gas in the winter for home heating than electricity generation. It's just, the efficiency standards are much better for that. And so, we have to keep all of those factors in mind, and the reality of where we are with technology and where we want to go. And I think 30 years passes in an awfully quick time. And so I think it's, fair to look at those, and you need to, but I still think that 30 years is a reasonable amount of time to still recover those investments, and they'll be needed in that time frame.
So, and I think that's a great response. And if I just add on, just with respect to the plan that we've developed, we're very excited about hydrogen and think it's an awesome opportunity. But, we were mindful, and in our plan, which does get to carbon neutrality, we have a relatively more modest amount blended in. So, again, that should, from everything we know at this point, although clearly additional testing and research is needed, we think that could be accommodated through blending with respect to our own system at this point. So, I think our pipelines in 30 or 50 years are quite needed. That's quite a reasonable time frame. And again, at least for us, the approach we took is we don't see really blending of hydrogen until like the 2040 zone or something. Just, we were pretty conservative with our assumptions, but we see a lot of possibility in other places that, maybe energy companies could engage in terms of transportation opportunities for heavy vehicles where, there may be not as many heavy vehicles, but the emissions are great, and the ability to fuel a heavy vehicle within a more traditional time frame rather than charging. We see just a lot of opportunity, and we're excited about it. So,
there's a question that I want to make sure we touch on, and because I don't, with only a few minutes left, I don't want to leave anybody with any misunderstandings, and I'm realizing that I may have a misunderstanding. And the question came in about the difference in cost, carbon intensity, and use case between RNG and biogas. So Richard, Sue, what's the distinction here? Is that a correct distinction? Are there differences in definitions between RNG and biogas? Help us out to make sure we're all on the same page, please.
I guess I can start it off. And biogas, the way I see it, biogas is the raw gas. It's the gas coming from the manure or the wastewater treatment plant or the landfill. And then it goes through a series of processes and gets refined. And that's when we start calling it RNG. So it's kind of the same thing. You're just talking about different steps in an industrial process.
Would it be safe to say that, biogas is less expensive presumably on a BTU basis because you don't have the added costs of treating it potentially, but maybe there are mitigating factors. You can't use it as in many places. It's you don't get the full benefit of carbon reductions. How do we compare the two? Is there something, is that accurate?
Well, I'll just say for us in our study, I don't want to add to the confusion, but we used the term biofuels just because I think more people understood generally what it was, but we are considering it fully renewable natural gas, especially when it comes to using it in our system. It would have to be treated, and any costing or assessment we did was based on the idea that it was renewable natural gas and pipeline compatible.
Okay, thanks. There's one more question open on the floor, and I think we'll try to squeeze it in here. And of course, people should, feel free to stick around for another minute or two if they want. And it goes back to some of the questions about regulatory framework. It goes back to questions about infrastructure. Are there regulatory aspects to trying to gather together gas or whether it's only biogas or it's already been treated, material from dairy farms rather than going to the wellhead? Are there any regulatory considerations about what a state can and can't say, for example, about infrastructure to collect that gas? Are there issues with federal state jurisdiction there that are open to question because, federal Natural Gas Act wouldn't cover some of these things? A big question, but, is there something there that needs addressing, or is that way down the list of things that are important? For anybody, really.
I don't have enough information to answer that question. Sorry.
Okay.
I'll jump on this one. It's a great question. Gathering lines for geologic natural gas are regulated in part at a federal level, but also in part at a state level. I would suspect that there will be similar types of regulatory considerations and there are regulatory considerations for these gathering lines, if you'll put it, for these RNG or biogas facilities. But I am going to defer that that's not a question I have a great answer for, but it's one I'm going to go study now that you've asked it. So if I have a chance, if you have a chance to ask it again of me, please do. I'll have a better answer.
Well, thank you. And thank you to our audience for all the excellent questions that did come in. We are at 3:30. I hope you will all join me in thanking virtually all of our excellent panelists for their time and their dedication to this important topic. And if you have a chance to interact with them, let them know that you appreciated their contributions. And we certainly appreciate that. There was a question that came in earlier about a recording of this. We do post recordings of our webinars to our channel on YouTube, which can be found under NRRI Media. And we're getting some thanks in on the chat, so that's good. So look for a recording there in a week to 10 days, maybe longer. We have some vacations coming up, but we'll get the recordings posted, and you can find recordings of all of our webinars on our YouTube channel. And we will also circulate this slide deck to everyone via the mailing list. And we wish you all a good afternoon and a good rest of your week and a good summer. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.